Welcome to Southern Cadence, where we read stories with a Southern charm. Sit back and get cozy while we read Chapter 9 of The Bandit of Hell's Bend by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 9. Lillian Manhill. "You sent for me, miss?" asked Bull as he stepped into the office the following morning, his hat in his hand, his chaps loose buckled about his trim hips, his two big 6 guns a trifle forward against the need for quick action, the black silk handkerchief falling over the blue shirt that stretched to his deep chest, and his thick black hair pushed back into an unconscious half-pompadour. From silver-mounted spurs to heavy hatband, he was typical of the West of his day. There was no item of his clothing or equipment the possession of which was not prompted by utilitarian considerations. There was ornamentation, but it was obviously secondary to the strict needs of his calling. Nothing that he wore was shabby, yet it all showed use to an extent that it made each article seem a part of the man, as though he had been molded into them. Nothing protruded with stiff awkwardness. Even the heavy guns appeared to fit into accustomed hollows and become a part of the man. The girl, swinging about in her chair to face him, felt a suggestion of stricture in her throat, and she felt mean and small and contemptible as she looked into the eyes of the man she knew loved her and contemplated the thing she was about to do. Yet she did not hesitate now that she had, after a night of sleepless deliberation, committed herself to it. "Yes, I sent for you, Bull," she replied. "The stage was held up again yesterday, as you know. Mac won't be fit for work again for a long time, and I've got to have someone to guard the bullion shipments. The fellow who came down with it yesterday has quit. He said he was too young to commit suicide." "Yes'm," said Bull. "I don't want you to take any chances, Bull. I would rather lose the gold than have you hurt." "I won't get hurt, miss. You don't mind doing it?" she asked. "Of course I'm a puncher," he said, "but I don't mind doing it, not for you. I told you once that I'd do anything for you, miss, and I wasn't just talking through my hat." "You don't do everything I ask you to, Bull," she said, smiling. "What don't I do?" he demanded. "You still call me miss, and I hate it. You're more like a brother, Bull, and miss sounds so formal." It must have been a woman who first discovered the art of making fire. A shadow of pain crossed his dark countenance. "Don't ask too much of me, miss," he said quietly as he turned on his heel and started for the doorway. "I got to the mine today, I suppose," he threw back over his shoulder. "Yes, today," she said, and he was gone. For a long time Diana Henders was troubled. The assignment she had given Bull troubled her, for it was a tacit admission that she gave credence to Colby's suspicions. The pain that she had seen reflected in Bull's face troubled her, as did his parting words and the quiet refusal to call her Diana. She wondered if these had been prompted by a feeling of pique that his love was not returned, or compunction because of a guilty knowledge that he had betrayed her and her father. Hal Colby had told her that morning of the bag of gold dust Bull had displayed in the poker game the night before, and that troubled her too, for it seemed to bear out more than anything else the suspicions that were forming around him, suspicions that she could see, in the light of bits of circumstantial evidence, were far from groundless. "I won't believe it," she said, half aloud. "I won't believe it," and then she went for a ride. All the men had left but Hal Colby and Texas Pete when she reached the corrals. But she did not feel like riding with Hal Colby that morning, and so she rode with Texas Pete, much to that young man's surprise and rapture. The days dragged along and became weeks. The stage made its 2 trips a week. The bullion shipments came through regularly and safely, and there were no holdups. And then one day, Morris B. Carson and Lillian Manhill arrived. The stage took the Bar Y Road that day and pulled up before the gate of the ranch house just as Diana Henders and Hal Colby were returning from a trip to the West Ranch. Diana saw Lillian Manhill for the first time in her life. The Eastern girl was seated between Bill Gatlin, the driver, and Bull. All 3 were laughing. Evidently they had been enjoying one another's company. Diana could not but notice it because it was rarely that Bull laughed. It was Bull who stepped to the wheel and helped her to alight. Morris B. Carson emerged from inside of the coach, through the windows of which Diana could see 3 other passengers, 2 of whom she recognized as the Wainwrights, and then she dismounted and ran forward to greet her cousin, a handsome, dark-haired girl of about her own age. Bull, still smiling, raised his hat to Diana. She nodded to him, briefly. For some reason she was vexed with him, but why she did not know. Bull and Colby ran to the boot and dragged off the Carson-Manhill baggage, while Lillian presented Carson to Diana. Carson was a young man, a typical New Yorker, in his early 30s. "Get a move on there, Bull," shouted Gatlin, "or they'll think I've been held up again." "I reckon the Black Coyote's gone out of business for a while," said Colby, shooting a quick look at Diana. Instantly the girl's loyalty was in arms. "He's afraid to try it while Bull's guarding the gold," she said. "How much longer are you in to keep me on the job?" asked Bull as he clambered to the seat of the already moving coach. "Mac looks pretty all-fired healthy to me." "Just another week or two, Bull," Diana shouted after him as the stage careened away at a full gallop. "Isn't he wonderful?" exclaimed Miss Manhill. "A real cowboy and the first one I ever talked to." "Oh, there are lots of them here," said Diana, "just as nice as Bull." "So I see," replied Lillian Manhill, smiling frankly at Hal Colby. "But Bull, as you call him, is the only one I've met." "Pardon me," exclaimed Diana. "This is Mr. Colby, Miss Manhill." "Oh, you're the foreman. Mr. Bull told me. How exciting." But he didn't tell you nothing good about me," said Colby. "He told me about your heroic defense of Diana and my poor uncle," explained Lillian. Colby flushed. "If it hadn't been for Bull, we'd all been killed," he said, ashamed. "Why, he didn't tell me that," exclaimed the girl. "He never said he was in the battle at all." "That is just like Bull," said Diana. They were walking toward the house, Diana and Colby leading their ponies, and the two Easterners looking interestedly at the various buildings and corrals over which hung the glamour of that irresistible romance which the West and a cattle ranch always hold for the uninitiated, and for the initiated, too, if the truth were but known. "It is just too wonderful, Mr. Colby," Lillian confided to the big foreman walking at her side. "But doesn't it get awful lonesome?" "We don't notice it," he replied. "You know, we keep pretty busy all day with a big outfit like this, and when night comes round, we're ready to turn in. We don't have no time to get lonesome." "Is this a very big outfit, as you call it?" she asked. "I reckon they ain't none much bigger in the territory," he replied. "And to think that you are foreman of it, what a wonderful man you must be." "Oh, it ain't nothing," he assured her, but he was vastly pleased. Here, indeed, was a young lady of discernment. "You big men of the great outdoors are always so modest," she told him, a statement for which he could find no reply. As a matter of fact, though he had never thought of it before, he realized the justice of her assertion and fully agreed with her. She was looking now at the trim figure of her cousin, walking ahead of them with Carson. "How becoming that costume is to Diana," she remarked, "and I suppose she rides wonderfully." "She sure does, and then some," he assured her. "Oh, how I wish I could ride. Do you suppose I could learn?" "Easy, miss. It ain't nothing once you know how." "Do you suppose someone would teach me?" She looked up at him archly. "I'd be mighty proud to learn you, miss." "Oh, would you? How wonderful. Can we start right away, tomorrow?" "You bet we can, but you can't ride in them things," he added, looking ruefully at her New York traveling costume. She laughed gaily. "Oh my, I didn't expect to," she cried. "I'm not such a silly as that. I brought my habit with me, of course." "Well, I suppose it's all right," he said politely. "But you don't have to bring no habits to Arizona from nowheres. We mostly have enough right here, such as they be, good and bad." Again her laugh rang out. "You big funny man," she cried. "You're poking fun at me just because you think I'm a tendershoe. Trying to make me believe you don't know what a riding habit is. Aren't you ashamed of yourself, teasing poor little me?" They were passing the bunkhouse at the time, where the boys, having scrubbed for supper, were squatting about on their heels watching the newcomers with frank curiosity. After they had passed, Shorty gave Texas Pete a shove that sent him sprawling on the ground. "Say," he said, "did you see them pants?" "I sure did," replied Pete, "but you don't have no call to knock me down and get my riding habit all dust, you gosh ding tendershoe, just because a guy blows in with funny pants on." "Did you see the mug on Colby?" inquired Ido. "He don't know riding habit from a cigarette habit." "I reckon he thought she was confessing a sin," said Texas Pete. "Oh, them pants," moaned Shorty, rocking to and fro on his heels, his long arms wound around his knees. Shorty was 6'3" and thought that Kansas City was on the Atlantic seaboard. Carson's keen, quick eyes were taking in the salient features of their immediate surroundings as he walked at Diana's side toward the two-story adobe ranch house, on two sides of which a broad covered veranda had been built within recent years. He saw the orderly, well-kept appearance not only of the main buildings but of the corrals, fences, and outbuildings as well. Everything bespoke system and excellent management. It was evidently a well-ordered plant in smooth running conditions. He thought of it in terms of Eastern factories and found it good. "You keep things up well here," he said to Diana Henders. "I want to compliment you." "Thank you," she replied. "It was something that Dad always insisted upon, and of course I have carried out all his policies since his death." "What are these buildings? They look like cement, but of course you wouldn't have that out here. The freight on it would make the cost prohibitive." "They're adobe," she explained, "just big clay bricks dried in the sun." He nodded in understanding. "Nothing much very fancy about the architecture," he commented, laughing. "The only attempt at ornamentation is that sort of parapet on the roof of the house with the loopholes in it, and that doesn't add much to the looks of the place." Diana thought that his criticisms were in rather poor taste, and that there was something about them that vaguely suggested the air of a man viewing for the first time a property that he had only recently acquired. Something proprietorial that she inwardly resented. Outwardly, she was polite. "You would think that it added a lot to the place," she told him, "if you should ever chance to be here when the Apaches stage a raid. It was never intended to be ornamental." He sucked in his breath with a whistling sound. "You don't mean," he exclaimed, "that they are so bad you have to live in a fortress?" "They haven't been on the warpath in any considerable numbers for a long time," she assured him, "but that parapet has been used more than once since the house was built, and there is always the chance that it may come in handy again. It may not be beautiful from this side, but I can tell you it looks mighty good from the other side when there are sneaking Apaches skulking behind every outhouse. I know, because I've viewed it under those conditions." "You think there is any great danger?" he asked her, looking about nervously. "There's always danger," she replied, for she saw that he was afraid, and a spirit of mischief prompted her to avenge his indelicate criticisms of the home she loved. "It's only a matter of weeks, you know," she reminded him, "since Dad was killed by Apaches." Carson appeared worried, and his further scrutiny of the house as they approached it was influenced by other than artistic architectural considerations. "I see you have heavy shutters at all the windows," he said. "I suppose you have them closed and fastened every night." "Oh, my, no," she cried, laughing. "We never close them except for dust storms and Indians. But suppose they come unexpectedly. Then we stand a chance of getting dust or Indians in the house." "I think you had better have them closed nights while Miss Manhill is here," he said. "I'm afraid she'll be very nervous." "Oh, your rooms are on the second floor," she replied, "and you can lock them all up tight. Possibly you'll get air enough from the patio. The nights are always cold, you know, but I'd feel stuffy with all the shutters closed." "We'll see," was all he said, but there was something about the way he said it that she did not like. In fact, Diana Henders was sure that she was not going to like Mr. Morris B. Carson at all. As they sat down to supper an hour later, Lillian Manhill looked inquiringly at her cousin. "Where's Mr. Colby?" she asked. "Over at the cookhouse eating his supper, I suppose," replied Diana. "Don't he eat with us? He seems such a nice fellow." "He is a nice fellow," replied Diana, "but the boys would rather eat by themselves. Women folks would take away their appetites. You have no idea how we terrify some of them." "But Mr. Colby seemed very much at ease," insisted Lillian. "Hal is different, but the very fact that he is a foreman makes it necessary for him to eat with the other men. It's customary." "Mr. Bull seemed at ease, too, after I got him started," continued Lillian. "He isn't much of a talker, but he didn't seem a bit afraid of me." "Bull is not afraid of anything," Diana assured her. "But if you got him to talk at all, then you must exercise a wonderful power over men. I can scarcely ever get a dozen words out of him." "Well, I guess I've got away with men," said Lillian complacently. "I'm afraid that you will find that Bull's not very susceptible," said Diana with just the vaguest hint of tartness. "Oh, I don't know," replied the other. "He has promised to teach me to ride and shoot." Diana ate in silence for several minutes. She was wondering already if she was going to like her cousin. But then, of course she was. How silly of her to think she was not, she concluded. "I met an old friend on the stage today," remarked Carson presently. Diana raised her eyebrows politely. "How nice," she said. Yes, it was. Haven't seen him for a couple of years. Nice chap, Jefferson Wainwright. Fraternity brother. Of course, I was years ahead of him, but I used to see him when I'd got on to Cambridge for the games. His governor's a nice old chap, too, and got a wad of the long green. So he has told us, said Diana. Oh, you know them? They didn't mention it. I have met them. Mr. Wainwright tried to buy the ranch. Oh, yes, I believe he did mention something of the kind. Why didn't you sell it to him? His offer was too low for one reason, and the other is that I do not care to sell my interest. Carson and Miss Manhill exchanged a quick glance that escaped Diana. How much did he offer you? Asked Carson. $250,000. Why, that seems a very fair price, said Carson. It is ridiculous, Mr. Carson, replied Diana, and if you are at all familiar with Mr. Manhill's business, you know it as well as I. I am very familiar with it, replied the New Yorker. In fact, from your remarks, I imagine that I am much more familiar with it than you. Then you know that the cattle interests alone are worth 3 times that amount without considering the mine at all. Carson shook his head. I'm afraid that way out here you are too far from the financial center of the country to have a very comprehensive grasp of values. Now, as a matter of fact, the bottom has dropped out of the livestock market. We'll be lucky if we make expenses for the next year or so, and it probably will never come back to what it was. And as for the mine, that, of course, is about done. It won't pay to work it a year from now. If we could get $250,000 for this business, we'd be mighty lucky, but I doubt if old Wainwright would renew that offer. He's too shrewd a businessman. Diana Henders made no reply. She was wondering just how much Morris B. Carson did know about the livestock market in the mine. She was inclined to believe that he knew a great deal more than his remarks concerning them would indicate. At the same hour, Mary Donovan's boarders were gathered about her table. She had other guests this evening in addition to her regular clientele. There were the Wainwrights, and Bull was there for supper and breakfast as was usual when the bullion came down from the mine. It was not a gay company. Mac Harbor and Jim Weller looked with suspicion on Bull, an attitude that would have blossomed into open and active hostility could they have gained the support of Gum Smith. But Gum was not searching for trouble. He glowered at his plate and hated Bull. Wildcat Bob inhaled soup and hated Gum Smith. The Wainwrights scarcely raised their eyes from the business of eating for fear of the embarrassment of meeting those of the man who had run the elder Wainwright off the Bar Y ranch, an occurrence which rankled horribly in the breasts of both. Bull, taciturn as usual, ate in silence with something of the mien of a lion feeding among jackals. Mary Donovan hovered in the doorway. Bull laid down his spoon, drank a glass of water, and rose from the table. "Sure, and you won't have another helping of pudding now, Bull?" urged Mary. "No thanks, Mrs. Donovan," he replied. "I'm plumb full." He walked past her into the kitchen and out the back door. An almost audible sigh of relief rose from the remaining guests. "I reckon he thinks he owns the shack," commented Jim Weller apropos of Bull's exit through the sacred precincts of Mary Donovan's kitchen. "Sure, he could have it for the asking, the fine boy he is," shot back Mary. "Him a-going out to fetch in wood for me little likes of ye, Jim Weller, what ain't fit to black his boots. Sits here and makes remarks about him, you lazy whelp." Mr. Weller subsided. The meal over, the guests departed with the exception of Mac Harbor, Jim Weller, and the Wainwrights who had congregated on the veranda. "You don't seem to like the fellow they call Bull," remarked the younger Wainwright to Weller. "I didn't say I didn't like him, and I didn't say I did," replied Weller, noncommittally. "Well, I don't like him," said Mac vehemently. "I wouldn't like my grandmother if she shot me in the belly." "You mean that he shot you?" asked Wainwright. "The black coyote shot me, and if Bull ain't the black coyote, my name's McGinnis." "You really think that he's been pulling off these hold-ups?" demanded the elder Wainwright. "I ain't the only one what thinks so," replied Mac. "Everyone, most, thinks so. And if we had a decent sheriff, that feller'd be behind bars where he belongs, strung up a cottonwood to Hell's Bend." "'Pears to me like Gum was either in on the deal or afeard of Bull." "Gum's afeard of everyone," said Weller. "Well," remarked Jefferson Wainwright, Sr., "when we come over on this side of the hills, I calculate as how things are going to be a heap sight different. There won't be no more of this here funny gunplay stuff. I'm going to run all these would-be bad men out of the country." "You figuring on coming over here?" asked Mac. "I certainly am. I'm a-going to buy the whole Bar Y outfit." "The hell you is!" exclaimed Mac. I heard that Miss Di wouldn't sell it to you. She ain't got nothing to say about it. I'm a-going to buy it from the man that's running that outfit now, and he's a mighty good businessman, too." "Who's that, Colby?" "No, Colby nothing. It's Mr. Carson in New York. He's handling all of John Manhill's interests, and he just come here today with Manhill's daughter. We'd come over on the stage with him. I was telling Carson of the fine airs that chit of a Henders girl puts on, but things is going to be different now. Carson's going to close out the estate, and the holdings here is as good as sold to me already." End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Bandit of Hell's Bend by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 10. Wildcat Bob Goes Courting. Bull sat in a corner of the Chicago saloon watching the play at the faro table. It was too early to go to bed, and he was not a man who read much, nor cared to read, even had there been anything to read, which there was not. He had skimmed the latest Eastern papers that had come in on the stage, and his reading was over until the next shipment of gold from the mine brought him again into contact with a newspaper. Then he would read the livestock market reports, glance over the headlines, and throw the paper aside, satisfied. His literary requirements were few. A man who had drunk not wisely but too well lurched up to him. "Have a drink, stranger," he commanded. It was not an imitation. "Ain't drinkin'," replied Bull quietly. "Oh, yes, you be," announced the hospitable one. "When I says drink, you drinks. See, I'm a bad man, I am. Whoopee!" And, drawing a six-shooter, he commenced firing into the floor at Bull's feet. Suddenly, a large man enveloped him from the rear, held his gun hand aloft, and dragged him away into an opposite corner where, to the accompaniment of a deluge of lurid profanity, he counseled him to greater discretion. "Why, you blankety blank blank blank," he cried. "You trying to commit suicide? Don't you know who that is, you bluther nidget?" Then he whispered something in the other's ear. The effect was electrical. The man seemed sobered instantly. With staring eyes, he looked across the room at Bull. "I'm going to get out of here," he said. "He might change his mind." "I can't see yet why I didn't bore ye," agreed his friend. "You better go and apologize." Slowly, the pseudo-bad man crossed the room toward Bull, who had not moved sufficiently to have changed his position since the man had first accosted him. The man halted in front of Bull, a sickly grin on his bloated countenance. "No offense, partner. Just had a drop too much. No offense intended. Just jokin'. That was all, just jokin'." Bull eyed him intently for a moment. "Oh, yes," he said presently. "I remember you now. You're that flannel mouth what got gay with old Wildcat a couple months ago. Did you ever return that window sash you took with you? I hearn Gum was powerful cut up about that window sash." Not the shadow of a smile crossed Bull's face. "I weren't there, but I hearn all about it." The other flushed, attempted some witty repartee that fell flat, and finally managed to make his escape amid a roar of laughter from the nearer card players and the spectators who had overheard the brief dialogue. Bull rose. "Goin'?" asked an acquaintance. "I reckon so. Good night." "Good night, Bull." The man stepped out into the clear, starlit night. Involuntarily, he turned and looked toward the northeast in the direction of the Bar Y Ranch. Diana was there. For a long time he stood motionless, gazing out across the arid, moon-bathed level that stretched away to her loved feet. What emotions played behind the inscrutable mask of his face? Who may say? As he stood there silently, he heard voices coming from between the Chicago saloon and Gum's place, liquors and cigars. "He's in there now," said one. "I can see him. If there weren't so tarnation many fellers at the bar, I could get him from here." "You better come along before you get in more trouble than you got the capacity to handle," urged his second voice. "That's all right. I know what I'm doing. There can't no dried-up old buffalo chip like that run me out of no man's saloon to get away with it, and that's all they is to that." "Well, I'm going home," stated the second voice. "I know when I'm well off." "You go home. After I shoot the ears off in this Wildcat Bob party, I'm coming home too." "You go to shooting any ears off in Wildcat Bob, and you won't need no blankets where you're going." "That's so? Well, here goes. You better stay and see the fun." "I'm going now while I got the chance," said the other. and Bull heard him coming from the side of the building. The former stepped quickly back into the doorway of the Chicago saloon, and an instant later he saw the large man who had dragged his friend from him a few minutes before pass up the street at a rapid walk. Then Bull looked from his place of concealment just in time to see another figure emerge from between the buildings and enter Gum's place. Bull was close behind him. The door was open a crack. He saw that the other had advanced into the room a few feet and was standing behind one of the rough columns that supported the second story. Across the room, at the far end, Wildcat Bob had just set down his whiskey glass upon the bar, wiped his beard on his sleeve, and turned away toward the tables where the gambling was in progress. For a moment he would be alone, with only the rough rear wall behind him. Bull saw the stranger raise his six-gun to take deliberate aim. He was too far away to reach him before he pulled the trigger, and it would do no good to warn the Wildcat. There was but a single alternative to standing supinely by and watching old Wildcat being shot down in cold blood by a cowardly murderer. It was this alternative that Bull adopted. As the smoke rose from the muzzle of his gun, the stranger threw his hands above his head. His weapon clattered to the floor, and he wheeled about. His eyes alighted upon Bull standing there, grim-faced and silent, the smoking six-gun in his hand. Suddenly the wounded man gave voice to a shrill scream. "He done it," he cried, pointing at Bull. "He done it. The black coyote done it. He's killed me." And with these last words the body slumped to the floor. Bull stood facing them all in silence for just a moment. The whole room full of men and women were staring at him. Then he slipped his gun into its holster and advanced into the room, a faint smile on his lips. He walked toward Wildcat Bob. "That hombre was after you, Bob," he said. "He was drunk, but I couldn't stop him no other way. He's the fellow you chased through the window that time." Gum Smith hurried to the rear of the bar. Then he leaned over it and pointed a finger at Bull. "You all's under arrest," he cried. "You all's under arrest for murder." "Go kick yourself through a knothole," advised Bull. "If I hadn't got that hombre, he'd have got Bob. There wasn't nothing else to do." "You all hearin' what he called him, didn't you?" yelled Gum. He pointed at first one and then another. "I deputize you! I deputize you!" he cried. "Arrest him, men!" No one moved except Wildcat Bob. He came and stood beside Bull, and he drew both his long, heavy guns with their heavily notched grips. "Anyone what's aiming to take this boy, why, let him step up," said Wildcat Bob, and his watery blue eye was fixed terribly upon the sheriff. "I want y'all to know that when I deputizes y'all's deputized," shrilled Gum. "You're hearin' what the corpse called him. Ain't that enough? Do your duty, men." One or two of the men, friends of Gum's, moved restlessly. Bull, sensing trouble, had drawn both his weapons, and now he stood beside the Wildcat, his steady gray eyes alert for the first hostile move. "Don't none of yo' gents go for to start nothin'," he advised. "You all seen what happened. You know I couldn't have done nothing else. And as for what that drunken bum called me, if Gum thinks I'm the coyote, why don't he step up and take me? I ain't a-honin' for trouble, but I don't aim to be the subject to no post-mortem neither." "Do y'all surrender, then?" demanded Gum. "Don't try to be no more of a damn fool than the Lord made you, Gum," advised Wildcat Bob. "You know that if this here boy ain't the black coyote, you don't want him. And if he is the black coyote, you wouldn't never get out and behind that bar if you was to try to take him. For my part, I don't believe he is, and I got two old pea-shooters here what thinks the same as I does. What do you think, Gum?" "Well," said the sheriff after a moment's deliberation, "I reckon as maybe the corpse was mistook. Have a drink on the house, gents." As Bull and Wildcat Bob entered the office of the Donovan house, Mary Donovan espied them through the open doorway of her sitting room and called to them. "Come in and have a drop of tea with me before yous goes to bed," she invited. And as they entered, she scrutinized Wildcat Bob with a stern eye. Evidently satisfied, her face softened. "I know they ain't run out of whiskey in Hendersville," she said, "so I reckon you must have run out of money, Wildcat." The little old gentleman reached into his pocket and drew forth a handful of silver, which he displayed with virtuous satisfaction. "The saints be praised," exclaimed Mary Donovan. "You've money in your pocket and you're home merrily and sober. Be you sick, Wildcat Bob?" "I've reformed, Mary. I ain't never going to touch another drop," he assured her solemnly. "You've not had a drink the evening?" she demanded. Well, he hesitated. You see. Yes, I see, she snapped scornfully. But Mary, I only had one little one. You wouldn't begrudge an old man one little nightcap. Well, she consented, relenting. One little one wouldn't do no harm. I wouldn't mind one myself. Wildcat Bob reached for his hip pocket. I was thinking that same thing, Mary, and that's why I brung one home for you. And he drew forth a pint flask. The devil fly away with you, Wildcat Bob, she cried, but she was smiling as she reached for the flask. Bull rose, laughing. Good night, he said. I'm going to turn in. Have a drop with us before you go, invited Mary. No thanks, I've quit, replied Bull. A moment later they heard him mounting the stairs to his room. He's a good bye, said Mary, wiping her lips and replacing the cork in the bottle. He is that, Mary, agreed Wildcat, reaching for it. There was a period of contented silence. It's a lonesome life for a witty lady, that it is, remarked Mary with a deep sigh. Wildcat Bob moved his chair closer, flushed at his own boldness, and fell to examining the toe of his boot. Mary rocked diligently, her red hands folded in her ample lap, keeping an eye cocked on the Wildcat. There was another long silence that was broken at last by Mrs. Donovan. Sure, she said, and it's funny ye never married, Bob. Bob essayed reply, but a mouthful of tobacco juice prevented. Rising, he walked to the office, crossed that room, opened the front door, and spat copiously without. Returning to the room, he hitched his chair closer to Mary's, apparently by accident, as he resumed his seat. He started, but it was evidently a false start, since he commenced all over again. Again he paused. You what? Inquired Mary Donovan with soft encouragement. You, said Wildcat Bob, and stuck again. Inward excitement evidently stimulated his salivary glands, with the result that he was again forced to cross to the outer door. When he returned, he hunched his chair a bit closer to Mary's. As you was about to remark, prodded Mary. Yes, said Mary. Go on, Bob. I was just going to say that I don't think it'll rain tonight, he ended lamely. Mary Donovan placed her hands upon her hips, pressed her lips tightly together, and turned a withering glance of scorn upon Wildcat Bob, all of which were lost upon him. He having again returned to whole-souled consideration of the toe of his boot, his face suffused with purple. Rain, muttered Mary Donovan. Rain in Arizona this time of year? Sure, and you mean ye thought it wouldn't snow, did ye? She demanded. Wildcat Bob emitted only a gurgle, and again silence reigned, unbroken for long minutes, except by the creaking of Mary's rocker. Suddenly she turned upon him. Give me that flask, she said. He handed it over, and she took a long drink. Wiping the mouth of the bottle with the palm of her hand, she returned it to him. Then Wildcat Bob took a drink, and the silence continued. The evening wore on. The flask was emptied, and midnight came. With it came Gum Smith, reeling bedward. They watched him stagger across the office floor and heard him stumbling up the stairs. Mary Donovan arose. Be off to bed, would ye? She said. I can't be sitting here all night gossiping, would ye? He too arose. Good night, Mary, he said. It's been a pleasant evening. Yes, said Mary Donovan. As Wildcat Bob climbed the stairs toward his room, he was mumbling in his beard. Doggone my hide, he said. If I had just had a couple of drinks, I might have done it. Sure, soliloquized Mary Donovan as she closed the door of her bedroom. It's not so dumb funny after all that the old fool never was married. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Bandit of Hell's Bend by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 11. Ride 'em, Cowboy. Lillian Manhill awoke early and viewed the brilliant light of the new day through the patio windows of her room. The outer windows were securely shuttered against Indians. She stretched languorously and turned over for another nap, but suddenly she changed her mind, threw off the covers, and arose. It was a hideously early hour for Lillian Manhill to arise, but she had recalled that there was to be a riding lesson after breakfast, and Diana had explained to her that the breakfast hour was an early one. Dressing, she selected a tailored walking suit. She would change it to her riding habit after breakfast, for she wanted to stroll about the yard a bit before breakfast, as she knew that this new walking suit was extremely fetching. A few minutes later, as she stepped into the yard, she saw signs of activity in the direction of the horse corrals, and thither she bent her steps. Texas Pete, who was helping the chore boy with the morning feeding, saw her coming and looked for an avenue of escape, being in no sense a ladies' man and fully aware of the fact, but he was too late. There was no avenue left, Willie and Manhill being already between him and the bunkhouse. So he applied himself vigorously to the pitchfork he was wielding and pretended not to see her, a pretense that made no impression whatever upon Lillian Manhill. She paused outside the bars and looked in. "Good morning," she said. Texas Pete pretended that he had not heard. "Good morning," she repeated in a louder voice. "Mornin'," replied Pete, pulling at the brim of his hat and immediately resuming the fork. He wished she would move on. The horses were fed, and there was no other excuse for him to remain in the corral, but in order to reach the bunkhouse he must pass directly by this disconcerting person. Diana he did not mind. He was used to Diana, and aside from the fact that he was madly in love with her, she caused him little embarrassment or concern, except upon those few occasions when he had attempted to maintain an extended conversation with her. Dr. Johnson would have found nothing in Pete's conversational attainments to have aroused his envy. Pete continued feeding the horses. He fed them twice as much as they could eat in a day, notwithstanding the fact that he knew perfectly well that they were to be fed again that evening. But finally he realized that he could defer the embarrassing moment no longer, and that the girl had not left. He stuck the fork viciously into the haystack and crossed the corral. He tried to appear unconcerned and to pass her by without looking at her, but in both he failed. First, because he was very much concerned, and second, because she placed herself directly in his path and smiled sweetly at him. "I don't believe I had the pleasure of meeting you last night," she said. "I'm Miss Manhill, Miss Hinder's cousin." "Yes'm," said Pete. "And I suppose you're one of the cow gentlemen," she added. Pete turned suddenly and violently purple. A choking sound issued from his throat, but quickly he gained control of himself. Something of that remark of hers removed instantly all of Texas Pete's embarrassment. He found himself at once upon an even footing with her. "No," he said, "I ain't one of the cow gentlemen. I'm only a tendershoe." "I'm sure you don't look it," she told him, "with those leather trousers with the fleece on. But you ride, don't you?" she added quickly. "I ain't learned yet," he assured her. "Oh, isn't that too bad? I thought of course you were a wonderful equestrian and I was going to ask you to teach me to ride. But you better come along after breakfast and we'll get Mr. Colby to teach us both." "I reckon he wouldn't like it," explained Pete. "You see, I'm in his afternoon riding class. He don't take nothing but ladies in the morning." "Oh, does he teach riding regularly?" "My, yes, that's what he's here for. He's learning us all to ride so's we can go out on hosses and catch the cows 'stead of having to hoof it." "I thought he was foreman," she said. "Yes'm, but that's one of his jobs. Larnin' cow gentlemen to ride." "How interesting. I've learned so much already, and I've only been in Arizona since day before yesterday. Mr. Bull was so kind and patient, answering all my silly little questions." "I reckon Bull could answer most any question," he told her. "Yes, indeed, but then he's been here in Arizona so long and had so much to do with the development of the country. Why, do you know he planted all the willows along that funny little river we followed for so long yesterday? Miles and miles of them." "Did he tell you that?" inquired Texas Pete. "Yes, isn't it wonderful? I think it shows such an artistic temperament." "There's more to Bull than I ever suspected," murmured Texas Pete reverently. A sudden, clamorous, metallic din shattered the quiet of the cool Arizona morning. The girl gave a little scream and sprang for Texas Pete, throwing both arms about his neck. "Oh, oh," she cried, "what is it, Indians?" "No," said Pete, striving to disengage himself, for he saw the malevolent eyes of several unholy cow gentlemen gloating upon the scene from the doorway of the bunkhouse. "No, that ain't Injuns. That's the breakfast bell." "How silly of me," she explained. "Now I suppose I must be going. I'm so glad to have met you, Mr. My name's Texas Pete. Mr. Pete, and I do hope you learn to ride quickly. I'm sure we could have some lovely excursions picnicking among the beautiful hills. Oh, wouldn't it be divine, just you and I, Mr. Pete?" And she let her great lovely eyes hang for a moment on his in a fashion that had turned more sophisticated heads than Texas Pete's. When she had gone and Pete was making his way toward the cookhouse, he ran his fingers through his shock of hair. "By gollies," he muttered, "the outside of her head's all right, anyway." As he entered the cookhouse, Shorty seized him and threw both arms about his neck. "Kiss me, darling," he cried. "I ain't had a single kiss before breakfast." "Shut up, you long-legged walrus," replied Pete, grinning as he shoved the other aside. He ate in silence, despite the jibes of his companions, who quickly desisted, realizing the futility of attempting to arouse Texas Pete's ire by raillery. He was quick enough of temper and quicker still with his guns when occasion warranted, but no one could arouse his anger so long as their thrusts were shod with fun. "Looky here, cook," he called promptly to that individual. "You're the best educated bloke of this bunch of longhorns. What's equestrian?" "Something you put soup in," replied the cook. Texas Pete scratched his head. "I thought all along that I didn't like her," he muttered, "and now I knows it." Diana Henders greeted her guests with a cheery smile and a word of welcome as they entered the dining room for breakfast. "I hope you slept well," she said. "Oh, I did," exclaimed Lillian Manhill. "I never knew a thing from the time my head touched the pillow until broad daylight this morning. I had a perfectly wonderful night." "I didn't," said Carson, and Diana noticed then that he looked tired and haggard. "What happened last night?" he asked. "Why, nothing that I know of," replied Diana. "Why do you ask?" "Have you seen any of your men this morning, or any of the neighbors?" he continued. "I have seen a couple of the men to talk with. We have no neighbors." "How many women are there on the place?" he went on. "Just Lillian and I." "Well, something terrible happened last night," said Carson. "I never spent such a hideous night in my life. It's funny you didn't hear it." "Hear what?" asked Diana. "That woman. My God, I can hear her screams yet." "Oh, Morris, what do you mean?" cried Miss Manhill. "It was about midnight," he explained. "I had been rather restless, just dozing a little, when all of a sudden the dogs commenced to bark, and then a woman screamed. It was the most awful, long-drawn, agonized wail I ever heard. Someone must have been torturing her. I'll bet the Indians were out last night, and the first thing you know, you'll hear about a terrible massacre. Well, it stopped all of a sudden, and pretty soon the dogs commenced to yap again. There must have been 50 of them. And then that woman shrieked again. I'll hear that to my dying day. I don't think you ought to let any of the men go away today until you find out just what happened last night. The Indians may just be waiting for 'em to go, and then they'll rush down on us and kill us all." A faint smile had slowly curved Diana's lips and brought little wrinkles to the corner of her eyes. "What are you smiling about, Miss Henders?" demanded Carson. "If you'd have heard that woman, you wouldn't feel like smiling, not for a long time." "That wasn't a woman you heard, Mr. Carson. Those were coyotes." He looked at her blankly. "Are you sure?" he asked presently. "Of course I'm sure," she told him. Carson breathed a sigh of relief. "I'd like to believe it," he said. "I'd sleep better tonight." "Well, you can believe it, for that is what you heard." "I'd hate to be caught out after dark by 'em," he said. "A pack of 50 or 100 such as there was last night would tear a fellow to pieces in no time." "They are perfectly harmless," Diana assured him, "and the chances are that there were no more than 2 or 3 of them, possibly only one." "I guess I heard 'em," he insisted. "They have a way of sounding like a whole lot more than they really are." He shook his head. "I guess I know what I heard." "I'll have to show that cook of yours how to make coffee," remarked Carson a few minutes later. Diana flushed. "I suppose we don't get the best coffee out here," she said, "but we are accustomed to it and learned to like it first rate. I think Wong does the best he can with what he has to do with." "Well, it won't hurt him any to learn how to make coffee," said Carson. "He has been with us a great many years and is very faithful. I think he would be terribly hurt if a stranger criticized his coffee," said Diana. "Morris is very particular about his food," said Miss Manhill. "It is really an education to hear him order a dinner at Delmonico's, and the way he does flay the waiters if everything isn't just so. I always get such a thrill. You can see people at the nearby tables listening to him and whispering to one another." "I can imagine," said Diana sweetly, but she did not say just what she could imagine. Carson swelled visibly. "Call the chink in, Miss Henders," he said, "and I'll give him a lesson now. You might learn something yourself. Way out here, so far from New York, you don't get much chance, of course. There's really nothing quite like the refining influences of the East to take the rough edges off of people. I think I prefer to speak to Wong privately and in person if I find it necessary," said Diana. Well, just so I get some decent coffee hereafter, said Corson magnanimously. Lillian Manhill, having finished her breakfast, rose from the table. I'm going to put on my riding habit now, Morris, she said. Go out and tell Mr. Colby to wait for me. Diana Henders bit her lip, but said nothing as Corson rose and walked toward the door. He was garbed in a New York tailor's idea of the latest English riding mode, and again Diana bit her lip, but not in anger. Corson, setting his hat jauntily over one eye, stalked into the open and down toward the corrals where the men were saddling up for the day's work. He lighted a big black cigar and puffed contentedly. As he hove in sight, work in the corrals ceased spontaneously. My God, moaned Texas Pete. Who left the bars down? Inquired Idaho. Shut up, cautioned Colby. That fella's likely to be boss around here. He won't never boss me, said Shorty. Not with that funny hat on. I wonder could I crease it, and he reached for his gun. Don't get funny, Shorty. They're friends of Miss Henders, whispered Colby. It'd only make her feel bad. He could not have hit upon a stronger appeal to these men. Shorty lowered his hand from the butt of his gun, and almost at once work was resumed. When Corson joined them, he could not have guessed that he was the object either of ridicule or pity, though he was of both. Say, Colby, he said, saddle up a couple of safe horses for Miss Manhill and me, and wait around until she comes out. I want you to give her a few lessons in riding. Did Miss Henders say it would be all right? He asked. You know the work is pretty well laid out, and we ain't got none too any hands. Oh, that's all right, my man, Corson assured him. You'll be safe to do anything that I say. I'm handling Miss Manhill's interests and looking after everything in general until the estate is closed. Just trot along and saddle up a couple of horses and see to it that they're gentle. I haven't ridden for a number of years, although I was pretty good at it when I was a boy. How Colby eyed Mr. Morris B. Corson for a long minute. What was transpiring in his mind it would have been difficult to guess from the expression on his face, though what should have been going on within the convolution of his brain the other men knew full well, and so they lolled around, their faces immobile, waiting for the fun to begin. But they were doomed to disappointment, for there was no gunplay. Colby, they thought, might have at least made the dude dance. Instead, he turned away without a word to Corson, gave some final directions for the day's work, swung into the saddle, and rode toward the office, utterly ignoring the Easter's instructions. Corson flushed angrily. Here, you, one of you men, he snapped, turning toward the punchers, most of whom had already mounted their ponies. I want 2 horses saddled immediately, one for Miss Manhill and one for me. Silently, ignoring him as completely as though he had not existed, the riders filed out of the corral past him. At a little distance, they drew rein, waiting for Colby. I've saw gall before, remarked Texas Pete in an undertone, but that there dude Tenderfoot's got more'n a brass monkey. If you don't corral that jaw of his pronto, growled Shorty, I ain't a-going to be responsible for what happens. I can't hold myself much longer. I wouldn't have took what Colby did, said Idaho. Some blokes'll take a lot to hold their jobs, said Shorty. They can have mine right now, stated Texas Pete, if I gotta take that dude's lip. Here comes the boss now, said Idaho. She'll settle things, dern her pert little hide, he added affectionately. Diana had stopped just below the house to listen to Colby, whom the men could see was talking earnestly to her. Look here, Di, he was saying, I want to know if I got to take orders from that tin-horn lawyer feller. Is he boss round his diggins, or is you? Why, I supposed I was, Hal, she replied, though I must admit that there appears to be a suspicion of doubt on the subject in Mr. Corson's mind. What has he said to you? Colby told her, repeating Corson's words as nearly as he could, and the girl could not suppress a laugh. Oh, I reckon it's funny, all right, he said testily, but I don't see the joke. Having a paper-collared, cracker-fed dude like that and calling me my man and ordering me to saddle up a hoss for him right in front of all the boys. Trot along, he says, and saddle up a couple of hosses and see to it that they're plumb gentle. My God, Di, you don't expect me to take that sort of jaw, do you? Diana, by this time, was frankly in tears from laughter, and finally Colby himself was unable to longer repress a smile. Don't mind him, Hal, she said finally. He is just one of those arrogant, conceited provincial New Yorkers. They are mighty narrow and disagreeable, but we've got to put up with him for a short time, and we might as well make the best of it. Go and ask Willie to saddle up 2 horses for them, and be sure that the one for Miss Manhill is plumb gentle. She accompanied her last instructions with the faintest trace of a wink. Colby wheeled his pony and loped off to the corral, where he imparted the boss's orders to the chore boy, Willie, lank, raw-boned, and pimply. Willie, who always thought of himself as Wild Bill, swaggered off to catch up the two ponies, grinning inwardly as he rode a gimlet for Mr. Morris B. Corson. Corson, seeing Diana approaching, had gone to meet her. He was still red and angry. "Look here, Miss Henders," he exclaimed. "You've got to tell these fellows who I am. I asked them to saddle up a couple of horses, and they absolutely ignored me. You tell them that when I give orders, they are to be obeyed." "I think it would be less confusing if the orders come from me, Mr. Corson," she replied. "It is never well to have too many bosses, and then, you see, these men are peculiar. They are unlike the sort of men you have apparently been accustomed to dealing with. You cannot talk to them as you would to a Delmonico waiter, unless you are tired of life, Mr. Corson. They are accustomed to me, we are friends, and they will take orders from me without question. So I think that it will be better all around if you will explain your wants to me in the future. Colby told me what you wanted just now, and the horses are being saddled." He started to speak, and then, evidently reconsidering, caught himself with a palpable effort. "Very well," he said presently. "Let it pass this time." Together they walked toward the corral, where Willie was saddling a quiet old horse for Miss Manhill. Beside him stood Gimlet, with drooping head and dejected mien. "Which one is for me, sonny?" demanded Corson. Wild Bill glanced up in sullen scorn, eyed Mr. Corson for a brief moment, and then jerked a soiled thumb in the direction of Gimlet. "What, that old crowbait?" exclaimed the New Yorker. "You said you wanted a gentle hoss," explained Colby, lolling in his saddle nearby, "and Gimlet won't pitch." "I don't want to ride a skate," growled Corson. "When I'm on a horse, I want to know I'm on something." "You'll know you're on Gimlet," Colby assured him sweetly. "He ain't so dumb as he looks. Just stick your spurs into him and he'll act quite lively." "All right," said Corson glumly. "Tell him to hurry. I see Miss Manhill coming now." There were others she saw her coming, too. Texas Pete was only one of them. "By golly," she exclaimed, "look what's got loose." Willie and Manhill was approaching jauntily, clothed in a black riding habit, with a long, voluminous skirt, a man's collar and tie, and a black silk hat with a flowing veil wound round it. Shorty eyed her for a long minute. Then he let his gaze wander to Mr. Corson. "It would never be safe for me to go to New York," he confided to Idaho. "I'd sure laugh myself to death." By the time Miss Manhill joined the group, the two horses were saddled, and Willie had led them out of the corral. "Mercy," exclaimed Miss Manhill. "Haven't you a side saddle? I could never ride one of those horrid things." "I'm sorry," said Diana, "but we haven't one." "I doubt if there's a side saddle in the county. I think you can work it, though, if you'll put your leg around the horn. Next time I'll fix you up with a skirt like mine, and then you can ride astride." "Are you sure the horse is perfectly safe?" inquired Lillian. "I'll have to have a few lessons before I can ride one of those bouncing ones. Oh, Mr. Colby, good morning. Here I am, all ready for my first lesson." Her eyes took in the punchers grouped a few yards away. "I see you're going to have quite a class this morning. Mr. Pete told me, though, that you taught the cow gentleman in the afternoon." Colby shot a quick glance at Pete, who had just been overcome by a violent fit of coughing, and, knowing Texas Pete as he did, grasped the situation at once. "Oh, I had to give up the afternoon class," he told her, "after I found they was a few like Mr. Pete who wouldn't never learn to ride." "Isn't that too bad?" she said politely. Then she turned toward Corson. "I think you'd better try it first, Morris. I'll watch how you do it." "All right," said he. "It's been a long time since I've ridden, but I guess it'll come back to me quick enough. I might be able to give you a few pointers at that." He walked up to Gimlet's offside and took hold of the saddle horn, neglecting the reins, which Willie still held. Gimlet eyed him sadly. When he essayed to place a foot in the stirrup, the pony sidestepped rapidly in the opposite direction. "You'd better mount from the other side, Mr. Corson," advised Diana. "These horses are not broken to work with from the offside." "I knew all along he was a damn Injun," remarked Idaho. "And you better take the reins. You may need 'em," supplemented Willie, who, at bottom, had a kind heart and shrank from bloodshed. Corson walked to the near side of Gimlet, gathered the reins loosely in his right hand, stuck a foot into the stirrup, took hold of the horn with both hands, and pulled himself laboriously into the saddle. Gimlet stood quietly. "Get up," said Mr. Horson, but Gimlet moved not. "Throw the hooks into him," shouted Willie gleefully. "Why don't the old skate go?" demanded Corson, shaking the reins. Use your spurs, called one of the cowboys. That's what you bought 'em for, ain't it? Mr. Carson used his spurs. The result was electrical, galvanizing Gimlet into instant and surprising action which glowingly elucidated the derivation of his name. He wheeled dizzily round and round upon the same spot, and with lightning rapidity. Mr. Carson's funny hat flew off. He clawed at the horn in intervals that he was not clawing at the loose reins in a mad effort to gather them. Then Gimlet bolted. He ran for some 100 yards, stopped, and commenced wheeling again. Mr. Carson lost a stirrup. Then he let go both reins and seized the horn with 2 hands. "Stop him!" he yelled. "Stop him! Whoa! Whoa!" "Rip him open!" shrieked Willie. "Spur him in the eyes!" "Ride him, cowboy!" yelled Idaho. Again Gimlet bolted, and this time Mr. Carson commenced to slip dangerously to one side. 100-yard sprint back to where he had started, and Gimlet paused to wheel once more. It was the end. Mr. Carson spun off, alighting on his back. He rolled over with surprising agility and on hands and knees crawled rapidly away from this man-eater that he was sure was pursuing him. But Gimlet was only standing dejectedly, with drooping ears. Carson came to his feet. The men about him, rough fellows with none of the finer sensibilities of New Yorkers, were laughing rudely. "It was a put-up job," he spluttered. "It was a put-up job. You'll suffer for this, Colby. You told me that animal was gentle." "I told you wouldn't pitch, mister," snapped Colby, "and he didn't pitch." Miss Manhill had started back toward the house. "I think I'll not ride this morning," she said. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Bandit of Hell's Bend by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 12. Carson Speaks. "Come here," he yells then to the rest of us boys. "Step up to the funeral and don't make no noise, the while we inter all the barbed wire what's here, after which we'll dispose of the cigars and beer," sang Texas Pete. "Hello, see who's came." Bull entered the bunkhouse with a grin and a nod. "Still singing, I see, Pete," he said. "Ain't you finished that one yet?" 2 weeks had slipped by since the arrival of Carson and Miss Manhill. Bull had just been relieved from duty as bullying guard and was only now returning to the home ranch. In the weeks that he had brought the gold down from the mine, there had been no hold-up. The Black Coyote or Gregorio had not once been seen. "How's everything?" asked Bull. "So-so," replied Texas Pete. "Where's Colby? I got a report to him." "Up at the house. He eats there now." Bull made no comment. He thought he understood why Hal Colby ate at the house. One day soon, doubtless, he would sleep there, too, as master. "This Manhill heifer got stuck on him and insists on his eating there," explained Pete. "Things ain't been the same since them 2 short horns hit the diggins. The boss, she looks tired and worried all the time and sad-like. I reckon she ain't got no more use for him than the rest of us." "Is Colby gone in this Manhill girl?" asked Bull. "I don't know. Sometimes I reckons he is, and sometimes I reckons he ain't. Looks like as if he weren't quite sure which side his bread was buttered on, and he's waiting to find out." Bull busied himself arranging his blankets on his old bunk, working in silence. Texas Pete eyed him surreptitiously. There was a troubled look in Pete's eyes. Presently he coughed nervously. The 2 men were alone in the bunkhouse. "Say, Bull," Pete finally broke the silence, "you and me's been good pals." Bull looked up from the work of folding his tarpaulin. "Who said we ain't?" he inquired. "Nobody ain't said we ain't," Pete assured him. "Then what's eatin' you?" "It's only just what everybody's sayin', Bull," said Pete. "I thought you oughter know about it." "What?" "That you and the Black Coyote are the same feller. Not that it makes any difference with me. I ain't askin' whether you are or whether you ain't. I'm just a-tellin' you for your own good." Bull smiled one of his slow smiles. "If I wasn't, I'd say so, wouldn't I?" he asked. "I reckon you would." "And if I was, I'd say I wasn't, wouldn't I?" "I reckon you would," assented Pete. "And what the hell's the use of saying anything?" he demanded. "And especially when I don't give a damn what they think." Pete shook his head. "I don't know," he said. Bull started for the doorway. "I'm going up to the house to report to Colby," he said. "Look out that Manhill heifer don't get her grub hooks on you," cautioned Pete. In the office he found Diana Henders writing a letter. She looked up with a little start as she heard his voice. "Oh, Bull," she cried, "I'm so glad you're back." "Thanks, miss. I come up to report to Colby, but I see he ain't here." "He's in the living room with Mr. Carson and Miss Manhill," she told him. "I reckon I'll see him later then." He started to leave. "Don't go, Bull," she said. "I want to talk with you. Please sit down." He walked toward her and lowered himself into the big easy chair that had been her father's. His movements were like those of a lion, silent, powerful, and yet without stealth. For the first time in weeks, the sense of loneliness that had constantly oppressed her vanished. Bull was back. It was as if a big brother had come home after a long absence. That was why she was so glad to see him. Her heart forgot the thing that her reason had been practically convinced of, that Bull was the bandit of Hell's Bend, that it was Bull who had been robbing her father and her for months, that it was Bull who had shot Mac Harbor. She only knew that she felt relief and safety when Bull was near. Nearly everyone feared him. Many hated him. Could they all be wrong? Could she alone be right in believing in him, as her heart did against the wise counseling of reason? "Yes, miss?" he said interrogatively. "The Wainwrights are trying to buy the ranch again, Bull," she said, "and Mr. Carson seems to favor the idea." "Do you want to sell?" he asked. "No, I do not, but the worst of it is the price they want to accept. $250,000 for all our holding, ranch, cattle, and mine. They are bringing all kinds of pressure to bear on me. Mr. Carson says I must either buy them out or agree to the sale. I haven't the cash to buy them out, and they won't take my notes." "Don't sell, miss, at that price, and don't sell at all if you don't want to. They can't force you to sell." "But they make it so unpleasant for me, and Mr. Carson is always telling me that the bottom has fallen out of the livestock business and that the new vein in the mine doesn't exist." "The livestock business is all right, miss. It wasn't never better. And as for the new vein, that's all right, too. I was scratching around a little bit myself when I was up there these past 6 weeks. The gold's there all right. The trouble is you ain't got the right man up there. That new superintendent looks to me like a sharper." "Did you know the Wainwrights was up there often?" "No, really?" "Yes, and that superintendent is thick as thieves with 'em. He has no business to permit them on the property." "He does, though," said Bull, "but he raised thunder when he found out I've been snooting around the workings. I don't like that hombre, miss." "Everybody seems to be against me, Bull, and it's so hard to know what to do, now that Dad's gone. Mr. Carson and my cousin are nagging at me all the time to agree to sell. Sometimes I'm almost determined to just to get rid of them." "If you want to get rid of them, miss, that's easy," said Bull. "All you got to do is say so, and I'll run 'em off the ranch and out of the county. I wouldn't like nothing better." "I thought you had taken quite a fancy to my cousin coming in on the stage," said Diana. "The only rope she could ever have on me, miss, is that she's your cousin," replied Bull, and she knew that he meant it. "If you want me to run him out of the country, say the word, and I'll start him in 10 minutes, and keep him on the jump, too." "I'm afraid that wouldn't do, Bull," she said, smiling. "I don't see why not," he replied. Just then, Hal Colby entered the room. He nodded to Bull. "You back?" Bull took no notice of a question so obviously foolish. "How long you been back?" continued Colby. "About half an hour." "Why didn't you report?" Colby was vexed. The easy familiarity of Bill's attitude, stretched comfortably as he was in Mr. Hender's chair, and then pleasant converse with Diana, galled him. "Ain't you got eyes?" inquired Bull. "Can't you see me sitting here reporting to my boss?" "You're supposed to report to me," snapped Colby. "I'm apt to do lots of things I ain't supposed to do," Bull told him softly. "I reckon most everybody knows that, too," said Colby, meaningly. "Come," cried Diana, "don't you boys quarrel. I have troubles enough now. Bull was looking for you to report when he came up here," she told Colby. "He asked for you." "Why didn't he say so, then? I got some work for him, and I've been expecting him all day." "Well, I'm here," said Bull. "What do you want me to do?" His voice, unlike Colby's, carried no trace of anger, if he felt any. "Kramer wants off a few days, and I want you to go over to the West Ranch and look after the hosses till he comes back. They's some colts over there that needs to be rid. Kramer will tell you all they is to do." "When do you want me to go?" "Tonight. That'll give Kramer a chance to get an early start in the morning." "All right," said Bull, rising. "Good night, miss." "Good night, Bull. I may ride over while you're at the West Ranch. I've been intending to look the place over for a month or more. Kramer said we needed some new corrals." He nodded and left the room. I don't see how you can be decent to a feller what's been robbing you and your dad for months, said Colby after Bull left. Or maybe you don't believe it even now. I know it looks suspicious, Hal, but it's so hard to believe it of Bull. I hate to believe it. I almost don't believe it. You're hard on him because you don't like him. Didn't I tell you he was one of my best friends? You know that, till I got wise to his game. I ain't a-wantin' no rattlesnake like that as no friend of mine. Diana sighed and rose wearily from her chair. I'm going to wash for supper, she said. She had been gone but a moment when Carson entered the office. Well, he asked, has she changed her mind? I didn't say nothing about the matter to her, replied Colby. It wouldn't have done no good after what I hearn Bold tellin' her just before I came in the room. What was that? Demanded Carson. He was a-tellin' her not to sell, and furthermore he offers to run you and Miss Manhill out of the country if she gives the word. What did she say to that? Carson's voice showed indications of nervousness. Oh, she wouldn't stand for that, of course, but he's a dangerous fellow to have around her. He's got too damn much influence over her. I wish we could get rid of him, said Carson. It seems funny that he isn't arrested when everyone knows he's the Black Coyote. He'll run his neck into a noose one of these days, replied Colby. But in the meantime, he may spoil this deal with Wainwright, said Carson, and I've got my heart set on that. I want to get out of this damned country. It gives me the willies. Too many Indians and coyotes and irresponsible kids with firearms. It isn't safe. I don't see why you're so anxious to sell now, said Colby. You can get more if you half try. That would mean going back to New York. There isn't any capital out here. Wainwright is a find, pure and simple. I can't chance taking the time to arrange a deal back east. I don't know what Miss Henders would be up to out here. What Miss Manhill wants to do is get some ready money out of it quick and get out. I guess there's only one thing to do, and that's to spring my last card on the girl. I'd rather have done it in an easier way, but she's so damn stubborn she's forcing me to it. To what? Asked Colby. Carson leaned close to him and whispered for several minutes into his ear. When he was through, Colby leaned back in his chair and whistled. You don't mean it, he exclaimed. Wainwright is coming over to Hendersville on the stage tomorrow, and I want to get this matter settled with the Henders girl so that I can have something definite to say to him. I think she's coming around all right now that she's commencing to realize that the mine's about played out and that the cattle business isn't much better. Of course, it don't make no difference what she thinks about it, except she could make it mighty unpleasant around here if she wanted to. She sure could make it unpleasant for you and Wainwright if she wanted to, agreed Colby. And don't fool yourself that she thinks the business ain't worth nothing. If you had her thinking so today, Bull's give her something new to think about since he was here. How's that? Demanded Carson. I hearn him tellin' her he'd been diggin' round in the mine when he was up there and that he knows the new veins rich as all get out. And he told her the cattle business was all right, too. I reckon she'll believe him afore she will you. Carson bit his lip. That settles it, he exclaimed. I've fooled around long enough. I'm going to tell her tonight. Outside the bunkhouse, some of the men were washing for supper. Inside, Bull was rolling and roping his bed preparatory to moving to the West Ranch after the evening meal. What you doin'? Demanded Texas Pete. You ain't quit. Going over to the West Ranch. Kramer's getting off first bell, explained Bull. Looks like they weren't crazy for your company here, remarked Pete. Bull shrugged his shoulders and went on with the business of half-hitches to the final lot, after which he tossed the bedroll onto his bunk. I shouldn't think you'd stay on, Bull, said Texas Pete. Let's pull our freight. I ain't never been to California, have you? The ex-foreman shook his head. I got my own reasons for staying on a spell yet, Pete, he said. Pete said nothing more on the subject. Bull's answer to his suggestion that they leave the country troubled him, however. It was not Diana Henders who was keeping Bull, of that Pete was certain, because Hal Colby had long since as much as admitted that he, Colby, was engaged to marry the dainty boss. It wasn't because of any love he had for the job, either. Texas Pete knew that, for Colby had never made Bull's job any too easy since the former had become foreman. And Bull was not staying because he loved Colby. It was true that he never spoke a derogatory word concerning him, nor once had he criticized his methods as foreman. But Texas Pete knew as well as though Bull had told him that the latter had no use for the foreman. What was it, then, that was keeping Bull? Texas Pete's loyalty to his friend made it difficult for him to harbor the only answer that his knowledge of events permitted him to entertain. But that answer to the question persisted in obtruding itself upon his consciousness. If Bull was, after all, the Black Coyote, he could not work to better advantage as Bandit than while in the employ of the Bar Y outfit, where he could easily obtain first-hand knowledge of every important bullion shipment. By golly, soliloquized Texas Pete, I don't give a dern if he be, but I'll be derned if I believe it yet. At the house, Hal Colby was talking earnestly to Lillian Manhill in the sitting room. Supper had not yet been served. Carson had gone to his room to clean up, and Diana had not yet come down. Look here, Lil, Colby was saying. I don't like the way Carson's treating Di. I think heap of that little girl, and I don't want to see her get the worst of it. Lillian Manhill reached up and encircled his neck with her arms. I thought you were all over that, Hal, she said. You've been telling me how much you love me, but how do you expect me to believe it if you're always thinking of her and not ever considering my interests? You want her to have all the property, and you don't want me to have any. You don't love me. Yes, I do, Lil. I'm crazy about you, he insisted. Then act like it, she advised him, and quit siding with her all the time. I'm going to be a rich girl, Hal, and we can have a mighty good time after we're married, if you don't go and make a fool of yourself and try to keep me out of what rightly belongs to me. I ain't always so darn sure you're going to marry me, he said gloomily. You've been pretty thick with that feller Carson, and he's sweet on you. Any fool could tell that. Oh, pshaw, exclaimed Lillian Manhill, laughing lightly. Why, old Morris is only like a big brother to me. Now give me a kiss and tell me that you won't let Diana or anyone else steal all our money. She drew his face down to hers, and their lips met in a long kiss. When they separated, Colby was panting heavily. God, he exclaimed huskily, I'd commit murder for you. In the shadows of the hall stood Morris B. Carson, scowling darkly upon them through the partially open doorway. Presently he coughed discreetly, and a moment later entered the room, where he found Lillian idly turning sheets of music at the piano, while Colby was industriously studying a picture that hung against the wall. Carson accosted them with a pleasant word and a jovial smile, and a minute later Diana Henders entered the room, and the four went into supper. The meal, like its predecessors for some weeks, was marked by noticeable constraint. The bulk of the conversation revolved about the weather, about the only thing that these four seemed to have in common that might be openly discussed. And as Arizona's summer weather does not offer a wide field for discussion, the meals were not conspicuous for the conversational heights attained. Nor was this one any exception to the rule. When it was nearly over, Carson cleared his throat, as is the habit of many when about to open an unpleasant subject after long deliberation. Miss Henders, he commenced. Hal Colby arose. I gotta see Bull before he leaves, he announced hastily, and left the room. Carson started again. Miss Henders, he repeated, I have a painful duty to perform. I have tried to work in harmony with you, but I have never met with any cooperation on your part, and so I am forced to reveal a fact that we might have successfully have gotten around have you been willing to abide by my judgment in the matter of the sale of the property. And what fact is that? Asked Diana politely. We will get to it presently, he told her. Now, my dear young lady, your father's death has left you in very unfortunate circumstances, but of course, as is natural, Miss Maddle wants to do what she can for you. I am afraid that I do not understand, said Diana. Lillian and I have suffered equally in the loss of our fathers and our uncles, and together we have inherited the responsibilities of a rather large and sometimes cumbersome business. I am sure that we wish to help one another as much as possible, I as much as she. I am afraid that you do not understand, Miss Henders, said Carson solemnly. By the terms of your uncle's will, everything would have gone to your father had he survived, Mr. Manhill, but he did not. Your father made a similar will, leaving everything to your uncle. So you see, Miss Henders, Carson spread his palms and raised his brows in a gesture of helplessness. I must be very dense, said Diana, for I am sure I do not know even yet what you are driving at, Mr. Carson. It's just this, he explained. Your father left everything to your uncle. Your uncle left everything to his daughter. It is very sad, Miss Henders. Miss Maddle has grieved over it a great deal, but the law is clear. It leaves you penniless. But it is not what was intended, and there must be another will, exclaimed Diana. Uncle John and Dad both wished that, when they were gone, the estate should be divided equally between their lawful heirs, half and half. Dad left such a will, and it was his understanding that Uncle John had done likewise, And I know he must have, for he was the soul of honor. Their wills were identical. Dad has told me so more than once. They had such implicit confidence in one another that each left everything to the other with the distinct understanding that eventually it was all to go to the heirs of both, as I have explained. I do not doubt that your father left such a will if you say he did, but the fact remains that Mr. Manhill did not, said Mr. Carson emphatically. But you shall not want, Miss Henders. Your cousin will see to that. She has already authorized me to arrange for an annuity that will keep you from want until you are married. We thought best not to continue it beyond that time for obvious reasons. You mean, asked Diana dully, that I have nothing, that I am a pauper, that even this roof under which I have lived nearly all my life does not belong even in part to me, that I have no right here? Oh, please don't say that, dear, exclaimed Lillian Manhill. You shall stay here just as long as you wish. You will always be welcome in my home. My home. Diana suppressed a sob that was partially grief and partially rage. The injustice of it, to take advantage of a technicality to rob her of all that rightly belonged to her. She was glad, though, that they had come out into the open at last. Why had they not done so before? Of course, said Carson, as Miss Manhill says, you are welcome to remain here as long as the property is in her hands. But, as you know, we have received an advantageous offer for it, and so it is only fair to tell you that you may as well make your plans accordingly. You are going to sell to Wainwright for $250,000, asked Diana. Carson nodded. Diana rose and walked the length of the room. Then she turned and faced them. No, you are not going to sell, Mr. Carson, if there is any way in which I can prevent it. You are not going to steal my property so easily. Why have you been attempting all these weeks to persuade me to agree to a sale if you knew all along that I had no interest whatsoever in the property? She demanded suddenly. That was solely due to a desire on our part to make it as easy as possible for you, he explained suavely. Your cousin would have given you half the purchase price rather than have had to tell you the truth, Miss Henders, but you have forced it upon us. She desires to sell. It is her property. You alone stood in the way. You have been your own worst enemy, Miss Henders. You might have had $125,000 had you not been stubborn. Now you must be content with whatever Miss Manhill sees fit to allow you in the way of an annuity. Diana squared her shoulders as she faced them. Miss Manhill shall give me nothing. I will not accept as a gratuity what rightfully belongs to me. If you think, Mr. Carson, that you are going to take my property away from me without a fight, you are mistaken. And she wheeled about and started for the doorway. Wait a moment, Miss Henders, cried the New Yorker. I am a lawyer, and I know how expensive litigation is. Such a case as you contemplate, and I take it for granted that you purpose taking the matter to court when you say fight, might drag on for years, wasting the entire property in attorney's fees and legal expense, so that neither of you would get anything. I have seen such things happen scores of times. Now, let us rather compromise. We were willing to make you a gift of half the purchase price immediately on the consummation of the sale to Mr. Wainwright. That offer is still open. It is extremely fair and generous, and if you will take my advice, you will accept it. Never, snapped Diana. Carson and Lillian sat in silence, listening to Diana's footfalls as she ascended the stairs. Presently they heard her door close. Then the girl turned upon Carson. You poor sucker, you, she exclaimed. What do you think you are, offering her $125,000 when we don't have to give her a cent? Don't be a hog, Lil, advised the man. We'll get enough, and if we can save a lot of trouble, we'd better let her have the $125. You can't tell what these people out here'll do. Take that Bull fellow, for instance. He's already offered to run us out of the country if she says so. Look what he did to old man Wainwright, for instance. Why, say, there are a lot of her friends here that would think no more of shooting us full of holes than they would of eating their Sunday dinners, if she just so much as hinted that she thought we were trying to do her out of anything. And we'll be getting plenty anyway. You and I each get a third, and Wainwright gets the other third, and that mine alone is worth millions. Why, we could afford to give her the whole $250,000 if she'd agree to the sale. I'm not so keen as you on giving my money away, replied Lillian. Your money, hell, he replied. You wouldn't have anything if it wasn't for me, and as for that measly little $125,000, why, it'll cost us all of that to square these people around here before we get through with it. I've promised Colby $10,000 already, and say, speaking of Colby, I saw you two in the sitting room before supper. You got to lay off that business. You're getting too thick with that fellow to suit me. You belong to me," he added suddenly and fiercely. "Oh, come on, Morris, don't be silly," replied Lillian. "You told me to get him on our side. How did you suppose I was going to do it, by making faces at him?" "Well, you don't have to go too far. I heard you telling him what you two would do after you were married. You may be a good little actress, Little, but that case you gave him looked too damn realistic to suit me. I'm not going to have you running off with him after you get your mitts on little money. Say, you don't think I'd marry that rube, do you?" And Lillian Manhill burst into peals of laughter. Colby found Bull in the bunkhouse. "Bull," he said, "I wish you'd ride up Belter's tomorrow and see how the water's holding out." "Listen, Bull," said Texas Pete, "I got the rest of it." And so we lines up at the bar, 12 or more. The boss tries to smile, but he can't, he's so sore. The stranger says, "Pronto, you durin' will runt." Just then we hears someone come in at the front, and turnin' to look we see there at the door a thin little woman, my gosh, she was poor, who lets her eyes range so they rest on this bloke with funny ideas about what was a joke. She walks right across and takes hold of his ear. "You ornery old buzzard," she says, "you come here." He gives us a smile that was knock-kneed and lame. And, "Yes, dear, I'm comin'," he says, and he came. End of chapter 12.